All right. Good morning again. It is a crisp November morning today. It's a beautiful day, but it is a little chilly out there today. And maybe that helps with the feeling. You can feel that the holiday season is upon us. Before we know it, suddenly it is arriving, right? In my neighborhood, already, it's been a couple of weeks already that we've started to see houses with Christmas lights already on them. So that we're getting a jump start on the season. The stores have already started to have all the things for the season that are out. Soon you'll start to hear the music play. You'll hear the Christmas songs. You'll start to see more and more of the decorations. Maybe you've started to get them out at your house. We'll start to have some of our family activities and some of our church activities that surround this season, and all of our traditions will start to come up to the surface, the things that we look forward to each year. In my house, one of the traditions that we have, well, and probably in a lot of yours as well, are certain movies that we watch this time of year or in the coming season. Christmas movies that have become a staple of our family that we watch every year. And one of those that has been around since the 90s for us is Home Alone. It is one of my wife's favorite movies. We watch it every year around the holiday season. And it's one of the movies, among others, not just in the holiday genre, but movies from a previous time period that when you watch them, you realize that this would never happen in the way that it happens in the movie. Just would not be plausible for it to happen today. There's so many things that are in place that work differently and technologies that exist that would make the plot impossible. And so if you've seen the movie Home Alone, you know that they sleep through their alarm clock because the power goes out, and so the alarm doesn't go off. Surprisingly, in a whole household full of people, one person has an alarm. But anyways, they don't have an alarm because the power went off. Of course, today, with most people use their iPhones or something similar for their alarm clock, so it would still go off. And so they leave behind their son, and they go off to France and realize that they've left him home alone, right? And of course, again, with today's technology, it would be a simple matter of sending him a text and saying, "Hey, are you okay?" Right? And they would suddenly resolve the issue right away. Maybe they could summon an Uber to bring him to the airport, and he could catch up with the family, something like that. The things just would not be plausible for it to happen with today's technology. And most of that is because we have technology that bridges a communication gap. So much of that movie and many others is how do we get in touch with each other when we're apart. And now we have these things that bridge that communication gap. It's so easy, no matter where you are in the world, to stay in touch, to reach out and have a conversation with somebody that you love. Even if you are on the other side of the world in a completely different time zone, you can connect. And so technologically speaking, you could say we are in a golden age of communication. And yet, why does it so often feel like communication is the very thing that breaks down in our society? Communication, we've never had greater access to it, and yet it's so hard to do it effectively. Everyone's voice is louder than ever, and yet no one feels truly heard. Never in history has the world been smaller and more connected than it is right now, but people are so divided and distant from each other. And this morning I want to suggest that if the church will be the church, then we can shine some light into that particular darkness. The message today comes from James. James chapter 1, verse 19, where Jesus' younger brother, James, shares this wisdom with us. He says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." James has these simple instructions, and this is what we're going to talk about today. Just these 3 simple instructions that James has that I think that if we will hear them, it will improve our ability to communicate with each other. And I think that if these instructions were taken seriously by the world, it would revolutionize, it would change the way the world interacts. If we listen, it'll improve our communication, it'll improve our connection, and as a result of improved communication and connection, our relationships can be enriched. And so let's just focus on these 3 instructions this morning: quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. First, quick to hear, quick to hear. Some translations will say quick to listen, which is a fair translation as well. Are we quick to hear? Are we quick to listen? Jesus says in Luke chapter 8, verse 18, consider carefully how you listen. Consider carefully how you listen. I've heard it said that listening is often the missing half of conversations. Listening is too often the missing half of many important conversations, and James teaches us that we would be wise to begin to practice it, to begin to practice listening. He says it this way: to be quick to listen. Quick. When we say quick to listen, it doesn't mean that we are just trying to listen really fast so we can get that part over with and we can move on to speaking. That's not quick to listen, although that is often people's practice. Quick to listen means that we are eager to do it. It is our priority. When we are engaging with someone else, our priority is to actually hear what they are saying rather than just waiting our turn to speak. So often we spend the time that we should be listening to what someone is saying, trying to formulate what our next response is going to be. James teaches us that we should be quick, we should be eager to hear. Often my kids have some priority in mind, something that they want to do, something that they have decided is what they're looking forward to for that day, and it could be any number of small things, but as soon as we arrive at our home or something, we get into the space where that is possibly going to happen, we're barely in the door, and our kids are saying, "Can we do that now?" And we're like, well, we're still got it. Can we just get settled for a minute? But they're eager to do something, and it just demonstrates when we have something in mind that is important to us, that we want to do, we have a quickness about wanting to achieve it, a quickness about wanting to engage in it. Do we bring that to our listening to others? Again, all too often, our pauses in the conversation are to prepare our next response. We have a desire to be heard ourselves, which is fair enough, but that desire often overrides our desire to hear the other person. James' writing is compared in a lot of ways to some of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, things like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And so we're actually going to read a lot of Proverbs today because the Proverbs have a lot to say on this very same subject. He is drawing from that wisdom as he gives this advice. Proverbs 18, verse 2. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. Which is hilarious, right? And this is one of the things I love about the Proverbs. They are hilariously savage sometimes. Just this thing. A fool only wants to express his opinion and does not listen, does not seek to understand. And then in verse 13, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Notice how the proverb there in verse 2 emphasizes understanding. Not just that the words, the sounds of the words enter our ears, but that we seek understanding. That's what truly listening is in a biblical sense. To be quick to listen is to be eager to understand what someone is trying to say, to understand where they're coming from, even if, and perhaps especially if, you disagree with what they're saying. It's important to listen to people that we disagree with because we want people we disagree with to listen to us, right? It's how this works. Sometimes people say things, of course, that are terrible. People say awful things sometimes, and they need to be corrected. But there's also the case that sometimes people just don't communicate very well, or they choose their words poorly, or they're trying to say something that's just tough for them to say, and what they say or how they said it could be taken the wrong way very easily. And perhaps that's been you sometime, where you've realized you didn't really put it into the right words before. If we are quick to listen, though, if we are eager to hear, then we try to listen past poor communication. We try to listen past those things, listen past those poor word choices that might offend us in some way, to try to discern what's the intention behind it. That's what truly listening to someone else involves, is seeking to understand their intention and not just to attack them for their words. So often people are looking for an excuse to attack, just trying to find the word that they find objectionable or the phrase that they can knowingly take out of context and throw back at someone. Amen. Our world does that to us so often, and we do the same so often to the world. And it must end. If we want to represent Jesus well, then we want to listen carefully. Proverbs 17, verse 27. Whoever restrains his words has knowledge. He who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. See, the Proverbs are funny. He's saying, again, even somebody who is a fool, if they just keep their mouths shut, they're at least doing that in wisdom, right? That's at least a wise thing that they can do. Sometimes, you can write this down, sometimes the best thing you can say is nothing. Sometimes that's the best thing we have to offer, is to say nothing and to listen. I'm convinced that a lot of avoidable arguments might never have happened if those involved had actually listened to one another. And I wonder how many friendships would be saved, how many marriages would be saved, how many church splits would be avoided, how many wars wouldn't have been fought if certain people had just taken the time to actually listen and understand the other side. If we could just delay what we have to say, if we could just delay it for a moment and listen just a little bit deeper first, if we could make our initial response to somebody a question rather than an attack, a question to seek a deeper understanding, there's really no better example at listening to others than Jesus. Like in all things, he is the one that we pattern ourselves after. He is the standard. He is the example. We saw a story last week of Jesus as a boy getting left behind at the temple, right? And do you remember, we looked at it last week, what he was doing when they found him? He was there conversing with the teachers, and it says that he was listening and asking questions. So from boyhood, we see Jesus doing what we're talking about. And I thought about putting some of these up today, but I'm just going to encourage you to go in your Bibles and to read these stories. Like, go read through the Gospels and pay attention to the way that Jesus interacts in conversation with people. Notice how he asks them questions and seeks to understand. You can go to John 4 and read the interaction of Jesus and the woman at the well and see how he listens and responds. Go to Mark chapter 10 and read the interaction with blind Bartimaeus and the way Jesus goes to him and says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Read the interaction that Jesus has with Martha in John chapter 11 after her brother has died and she is in distress coming to him. See how he listens to her. Why does Jesus do this? Why does Jesus listen and converse with people in this way? Well, because Jesus is wise, and this is wisdom to practice these things, but it's more than that too. Because actually listening before we speak is not only wise, it is also an act of grace and love. Listening to someone demonstrates something to them. It's a way of saying to them that you care, you see dignity in them. And that's what people can communicate. That's what we can communicate to other people by learning to be better listeners. Of course, there is a time to speak, but first, we have to listen. First, we have to listen. Ephesians 4:29, Paul says, in the way that we speak, let no corrupting talk, NIV says unwholesome talk, come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. How can we know what fits the occasion? How can we know what will provide the needed grace in that moment unless we listen? Occasionally around here, when someone is sick or has had some event, life event happen, we will organize a meal train for them. And so some of our members will get together and decide we're going to take them a meal and sign up for different days to bring food to them. And almost always when I see this go through, there is a question that is asked, like, does your family have any allergies or foods that you don't like and things like that, so that they can make decisions about what kind of food to prepare to bring. And so asking these questions and listening to what those answers are provides the context for what is brought into the situation. And the same is true in our conversations. How do we know what will be the wholesome talk, that which is nourishing? How will we know what is building up, what fits the occasion, until we seek to listen, ask questions, listen, so that we can respond in a way that is fitting? Also, Colossians, Paul says, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Again, how do you know until you listen? How do you know? Paul encourages us to prepare our words thoughtfully by having the grace to listen carefully. And so as we choose to listen, as we fill in that missing half of the conversations, as we learn to get better and better at that and actually listen before we speak, and as we prepare to speak, we still listen, we are saying, I love you. Which is important because Jesus said to love your enemies, right? So even somebody that's on the other side of a conversation that is opposing us, that is perhaps wanting to tear us down, believe it or not, we can actually listen and love our enemies in that way. Doesn't mean we agree. It means that we want to understand. And so let's go back to our main passage, James 1:19. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear. We've covered that. And let him be slow to speak, and slow to anger. And so we hear, and as we hear, we recognize that there is a need to respond. As you prepare what you will say in response, I want to encourage you to put your words in the crock pot instead of the microwave. Let them stew for a minute, okay? Don't just jump into it and throw out the first thing that comes to mind. If you've never done that before, I can tell you from experience, it's not a good idea, okay? I imagine most of us, though, have done that from time to time. We've spoken. Our mouth has gotten ahead of our heart. And we need to slow down. Even if someone has been thoughtless with their words towards you, you should be thoughtful in your response. Because when we do that, it can be an opportunity to change the tone of the conversation. It doesn't always work, but it's an opportunity to change the tone of the conversation. Because to be slow to speak, to take a beat, is to be patient. It is to bring patience into a conversation that just might be getting heated, and to slow the pace down just a little bit. And when our words are delivered with patience and respect, they are much more likely to be well received, right? If somebody responds to you with patience and respect, aren't you more likely to hear them out? That is true of the way that we should speak to others. There are, again, of course, there are times for strong words. Absolutely. But many people reach for those strong words a little too quickly. Have you been on the internet? People are vicious out there. There is venom in those words that get haphazardly posted into comment sections that you would think would just be innocuous posts, and they sort of devolve into these mudslinging contests in the comment sections. Have you seen that before? Amid all that name-calling and character assassination, has any person that's been a victim of that ever said, you know what, that's a good point, I think I'll change my mind? No. It just escalates into firing bigger and bigger missiles. We have to bring something else to the conversation. We don't want to just further often unnecessary conflict. And again, the wisdom passed down from the Proverbs comes to us in Proverbs 15:1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger, right? In verse 5, a gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. So we should be careful how we speak. And to say a soft answer turns away wrath is not to say that we are to be soft. It's not to say that we are unwilling to say or stand for hard truths, but it is to say that we are thoughtful, we are loving, we are patient, we are respectful in how we communicate those hard things. We stand for a God who loves, a God who seeks to bring those who are turned against him, seeks to bring him under him, to be in a loving relationship with him. And yes, sometimes that brings up some very hard condemnation of sin. But we have to approach those things in a way that can be received as much as possible. 1 Peter chapter 3, speaking to people who are under persecution, like most of us have probably never faced. He says, even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet, do it with gentleness and respect. Isn't that interesting? You see how this thread just weaves together all the way from the ancient Proverbs all the way through the New Testament to various writers bringing up this very same thing. Hear this. The goal of sharing the gospel is to win souls, not arguments. So part of being slow to speak may be to take time to consider our own intent. You said we want to listen for another person's intent that they're bringing to it, but do we stop and consider, what am I really seeking? Am I seeking to simply win this argument? Or am I seeking another person, another soul for God's kingdom? Probably if we are seeking to win every argument, we will lose every relationship. we have to choose people. We have to choose to love. Back to our text. Let every person be quick to hear. Let them be slow to speak. And lastly, let them be slow to anger. Slow to anger. And again, it's not that there isn't reason to get angry. Anger has a place. It's not that there's no reason for anger or that we suppress all of our anger and just stuff it down inside of us. But the truth is, we should not be living on the edge of our next flare-up of anger. Like, it should take a lot to draw it out of us. And when it does come out, it should be motivated by love. And that may sound strange to say that anger would be motivated by love, but look at the example of our God, who is long-suffering, he is patient, and when he does have anger, it is because he sees something that is a danger to the people he loves. And he pursues to rid them of that. That's when God's anger emerges. Our God is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. It is proclaimed over and over again, and we want to be children of our Father who represent him well. And so we must be careful. Again, there are reasons to be angry, but we must be careful about letting anger fuel our words. It burns too hot. It's too hot of a fuel. It has its place, but it should stay out of the driver's seat in our lives. This past summer, I think it was back in June, I did a series talking about taking our thoughts captive. And one of the things that we talked about then was taking captive our angry thoughts. And if this is a part that resonates with you, I would invite you to go back to our app or our website and go back and find that lesson and reflect on that again. But I want to bring up some of the passages that we looked at a few months ago when we did that. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 9. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Anger lodges in the heart of fools. So the word lodges there is the word that it resides there. Like that's it's moved in. That's where it lives now. And if anger has moved in and it resides, it lives in your heart, that's the place that it calls home, then that produces foolish behavior out of us. We need to evict it from living there. It leads to foolish actions. It leads to reckless behavior. It leads to rash words that just can't be taken back. Once they're out, they don't come back. We can try to do damage control, but you can't take it back. This one, another proverb, has really struck a nerve with me and stayed with me. Proverbs 19:11. Good sense makes one slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook an offense. It is his glory to overlook an offense. Does anyone do that anymore? Does anyone overlook an offense? Our world really needs to take this to heart, I think, because people are eager to be offended. Even when it is clear that the offense wasn't intended and it was not necessary to be offended, the world seems to find being offended by something as virtuous. It is virtuous to be bothered by something, like you're taking up somebody's cause or something like that, but it is out of hand. Think about the phrase, to take offense. To take it. To take offense is a choice. Now, the thing that we might be offended by, we may not have any control over that thing happening, but we choose whether we will be offended by it or not. We can choose to take no offense. And so we can speak the truth. We can stand for what is right out of love, and we can let offense just roll off of us as much as possible. And I want to encourage you to do that. We have to be very careful, as I said, about letting anger fuel our words. Why? Well, James tells us, we've been looking at verse 19, but let's push on to verse 20 as he explains the anger. He says, "For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." And the righteousness of God is what we really should be after. Like when we see something that is wrong and it rightly makes us angry at times, the solution to that, the thing that solves that problem, is God's righteousness coming to bear on it. But acting out of our own anger does not produce that result. The best that we can hope for in that is producing a kind of self-righteousness rather than the righteousness of God. The world has seen a lot of that from the church. But not just the church. The world is full of self-righteousness all over the place. But we have a responsibility as the church to show something different, to show the righteousness of God and not to be fueled by our own anger. Our own anger is like one of those lights on your dashboard that signals something's wrong, and we turn it to God. And we call for God's righteousness to bear on these things. And we let go of our own offense. We must be very careful about letting anger fuel our words, because it can quickly become about ourselves rather than God. Trying to make things right in line with what I'm offended by and you making it right with me, right? That's what it can become about, rather than bringing about the righteousness of God. We are intended to shine the spotlight on our God, to show His glory, but when we start to make things about our own personal offendedness, we place ourselves center stage. And it's like we step in front of God for the world to see us instead of Him. And that is exactly where we should not be. One more, what I think is a funny proverb. Chapter 30, verse 32. "If you have been foolish, exalting yourself, or if you've been devising evil, put your hand on your mouth." If you find that your heart is in the wrong place, you've been focused on yourself, again, the best thing you can say at that moment is nothing, right? Put your hand on your mouth, because only evil will come out of it. You may be able to think of exceptions, but for the most part, if we feel offended about something, it might be a signal that something needs to be addressed or corrected, but our feeling of offense is our own issue to sort out before God. Like if I'm offended by you, that's more my problem than your problem, okay? And there might be something that needs to be dealt with. There's something that could be wrong that needs to be addressed, but my feeling of offense is something that I need to let go of. It's something that I need to be before God, trying to deal with that way. That is my problem. And we will be blessed. We will be a blessing if we will be slower to get angry. If we have a much, much longer fuse. If we will be slower to give that anger that we might have a voice. Because as we give anger more and more of a place in our lives, it obscures our mission. Our mission becomes about ourselves rather than God. It obscures our message, because our message becomes muddied by our own anger, our own thoughts, and our own pride. And so, to bring this to a close, I want to look again at Ephesians 4:31. "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you." This is the spirit that we bring into our relationships with one another. It's the spirit that we bring that overflows out of us in all the relationships that we have. And it's how we best represent our God. So let us learn and practice the godly art of communication. Let us place others before ourselves, granting dignity and grace and the benefit of the doubt to those we love and to those that we are learning to love. May we let go of selfish anger and place the focus on our God. And may we be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow